We'll be back next week for Shabbat. I have been very thankful for this time that we've been able to study together. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. I've certainly had a chance to see some old friends from my time studying with you out in California and to meet some new friends too. It's been a privilege and I thank you for that. Let us begin with our blessing for study. Let me pull it up on the screen share. Here's our blessing for study. Everyone please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעשות divrei Torah. Blessed you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who follows us with mitzvot and commands us to busy ourselves with words of Torah. And we are certainly busy this morning. We've got a lot of Torah that we're looking at this morning. So the portion for this particular Shabbat is Parshat Vayetzei from the book of Genesis, and it involves the stories that begin to detail the life of our ancestor Jacob and the various experiences that he has in dealing with his multiple wives and also the challenges that he has in dealing with Lavan, his father-in-law. Who is the sort of prototype of the bad father-in-law for all of tradition moving forward. So we're going to take a look at some things this morning that come from a little bit later in the Parsha, mainly, chapter 30 of the book of Exodus. So if you have a different text that you'd like to follow along, you're certainly welcome to do that. I will, as I have in the last several weeks, do a screen share of the text packet that I put together for you all. If you look in the chat, there is a link to the document yourself. If you want to download it and look at it, you're certainly welcome to do so. And as I said in the times we've studied before, if you got a question, if you got a comment, if you got a thought, shout, do something to get my attention, send me a chat in the chat box, call me on my cell phone if you have my number. Do something to get my attention. I'd be happy to address or answer any questions or thoughts that you might have as we look at the portion for this morning. As wonderful as Zoom is, it certainly lacks some of that spontaneity and interaction that we're able to do when we're in person, and so we have to make do as best we can. So let me go now to the screen share for our packet for this morning. So here is the Vayetzei packet, and hopefully you can all see it. Let me know if you don't see it on your screen, and we'll see if we can't do some text support for you there. Pull up the chat box. So as I said, if you got a question or thought, go ahead and shout out or pop me a note in the chat, and I'll certainly endeavor to answer whatever questions or thoughts you folks might have. So as I said before, we're taking a look here at chapter 30, and there's a number of bits and pieces in this section of the Torah portion that demand some discussion and comment, because there are parts of it that are not clear, or are not as clear as they might be were we just kind of reading them without the commentary. So I've got some interesting bits and pieces from the rabbis that I brought in this morning for us to look at and talk about that hopefully help us to understand this story a little bit better and to flesh out the characters a little bit better. Because this section of text serves to give us some important information about the nature of the three main protagonists in this story, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, as we're going to see. So let's take a look at the first section here. So this is Genesis 30, verses 1 through 8. I'm going to go ahead and read through it, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So now remember, right, when Jacob first showed up in Haran, and he met Lavan, and he met Rachel and fell in love with Rachel and said to Lavan, this girl is beautiful, I'll marry her. What should I do? He said, you work 7 years and you can marry Rachel. So he works the 7 years, and as the Torah tells us, they go by as if it was one day. And the day comes, he says, okay, let me marry my wife. And so Lavan makes a wedding feast, presumably gets Jacob liquored up. And in the morning he wakes up and he rolls over, and it's not Rachel laying next to him, it's Leah. And of course he's a bit ibbled by this, as one might imagine. Where did this vault? Hang on. Let me see if I can fix this. There we go. He's a little able by this, as I'm sure you can imagine. And he goes to Lavan and says, hey, what the hell? You screwed me here. And Lavan says, well, it's not our custom in this place to marry the younger before the older. Make a deal. You can wait a week and then you can marry the other one too, but you got to work another 7 years. And of course, Jacob was so in love with Rachel that he was willing to do this. So now Jacob has not one wife, but two, and a growing household that he has to concern himself with, which is kind of the underlying story to the section of text that we're looking this morning here. When Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children, she became envious of her sister. And Rachel said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, when we were looking at Chaye Sarah, there are themes that repeat over and over again in the book of Genesis. And one of these themes that repeats over and over again is this idea of the woman being barren, being unable to have children. We see it with Abraham and Sarah. And we see it again with Isaac and Rebekah, and now we're seeing it with Jacob and Rachel. Although there's a different character to it this time, as we're going to see. So Rachel's so upset, she says, give me children or I shall die. Now, Jacob was not happy at this. Jacob felt as if he was being put upon by this, and lashes out back at Rachel and says, look, can I take the place of God, right, who has denied you the fruit of the womb? And finally, she says, look, here is my maid Bilhah, right? Consort with her that she may bear on my knees and that through her I too may have children. So she gave him her maid Bilhah as concubine, and Jacob cohabitates with her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, aha, God has vindicated me indeed. The Eternal One has heeded my plea and given me a son. Therefore, she named him Dan. And if we're looking at the Hebrew here, take a look. So here is Dan in the Hebrew. Okay? It's absolutely related to the Hebrew word din, which means law or justice or judgment. Right? So here she's saying God has judged me worthy and given me a son. Right? Therefore, she named him Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived a second time and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, a faithful contest have I waged with my sister. Yes, and I have prevailed. So she has named him Naphtali, right? And it's related to this word Naphtali here, this contest that she's had with her sister. And so she names him Naphtali. And here we have that she's now had these two sons that sort of count in her column. And I say that deliberately, counting in her column, because as we look at how the rabbis sort of look at this and view this, we're going to see that it's absolutely this contest and the tallying that we see that's going on here. So what seems surprising or troubling in this passage? What do we see here that might cause us to pause and say, let's talk about this, because it's not quite kosher of a yosher here. What seems odd about this? Yeah, Steve-O.
Well, to begin with, I think because Jacob has had numerous children already, they knew enough at the time that Rachel should have figured it was not his fault.
Good. Right. So this is part of the underlying bit of this, is that when we read the story, Jacob doesn't sound like that good of a guy here. Okay, let's take a look at what Rashi says about this. So here we have this first comment from Rashi, where he wants to parse out this line that Rachel says, Chava li, right? Give me children. And essentially says, look, is this what your father did to your mother? Right? Remember, this is not the first time that this has happened in this family. It happened with the grandparents, it happened with the parents, and now it's happening with this generation. She says, listen, when this was going on with your parents, when Rebecca was barren, those 20 years, and we learned about that last week, right? We learned it was this period of 20 years, because they get married, he was 40, and they was 60 years old when the kids were born. And it tells us that Rebecca was barren, and so Isaac interceded with God on her behalf. That's what she's saying. Is this what your father did? He didn't just sit by. He didn't just do nothing. He got involved in the situation, right? He didn't. He prayed for her behalf. Jacob, why aren't you advocating? Why aren't you being my helper in this moment? And she's a little she's pissed off about that, right? She's angry. She says, you're not doing what you're supposed to do for me, right? Now, Jacob responds with upset, right? He's ticked that she's calling him out like that, right? And he's angry. And this is how Rashi says, "He's denied you the fruit of the womb," right? This is Rashi again. Now, this is what Jacob is saying. You want me to do what my father did, but I am not like my father, right? My father did not have children. I do. God denied you, not me, right? Jacob gives this really harsh reply back to Rachel, right? He says, it's not your problem. Sorry, it's not my problem, right? It's your problem. I am perfectly fertile. Look, I have had relations with Leah and she's born me a bunch of kids at this point. So don't for a second pretend like it's my issue here. And Jacob does not look too good in this story. And the way Rashi's reading this text actually makes him look even worse, right? Because he sounds like he's not even being sympathetic to her plea. He's not even responding to her plea with any sense of kindness or menschlich, attitude toward this. And he really doesn't sound like a very good guy in this instant. And she says, listen, go into my maid Bilhah and, have a relationship that I too may have. What did she mean by two? Rashi asks, right? She was telling, look, your grandfather Abraham had children by Hagar, right? But still, quote, rolled up his sleeves and did his best to help Sarah. She replied, my grandmother herself brought her co-wife into the house. And Rachel said, if that is all that's stopping you, then here is my maid Bilhah. Consort with her that I too may have children just like Sarah, right? I'm fine. If that's what's stopping you, if that's the issue, fine, forget about it. I will get a wife. I'll get an extra gal. I'll bring my maid in here and you can cohabit with her. And that way I can have children. They'll be counted into my column, right? Counted into my column. Everyone see that and understand it, right? The questions about that, right? What Rashi's saying, how he's explaining it for us. Yeah, we're pretty good with that? More or less, yes or no? Good? Yeah, okay. Nachmanides comes along writing about 100 years later, and he wants to give us a little more explanation for this, but he takes us in a very different direction. Give me children, I shall die. Rashi's comments are from Midrash. He says, listen, Rashi gets this from a Midrash. We get that. Fine. Geg is into hate. Right? But that's not really the question here. That's really not what the question is. The question here that we're worried about is this section that said Jacob was incensed with Rachel. He was mad at her for coming at him and accusing him in this way. And he gives this response by saying, it's not you. It's not me, it's you. Right? But Nachmanides doesn't want to accept that. Right? Nachmanides holds Jacob in too high of esteem. It can't be that. It's got to be something else. Why would Jacob get angry rather than pray for her? This doesn't sound like the Jacob that we know. Remember, Jacob is our great ancestor. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. Jacob has 12 tribes. All Jews that are alive today are descendants from one of those 12 tribes. We are literally Bnei Israel. This is our founder, more so even in some regards than Abraham, right? And we can't let him look like he's kind of a jerk in this situation. After all, right? God hears the prayer of the righteous. True, it was Rachel who was prevented from having children, not Jacob himself. But do the righteous never pray for others? He asks. Of course they do. Look at the example of Elijah and Elisha. Right? Elijah and Elisha, these prophets that we know about. Elijah, we know. You've met him. Anyone been to a Seder before? If you've been to a Seder before, you've met Elijah. Okay, you've been to a Brit Milah before, you met Elijah. He shows up at these events. Elisha was his understudy. When Elijah goes to heaven in a fiery chariot, Elisha takes over the role of being the prophet in his stead. They prayed for various women's children and non-Jewish women at that. Okay, this is what the righteous do. The righteous pray for women and their children. So why isn't that Jacob doesn't do what he's supposed to do? Because obviously he's a righteous person, right? Caesar was an honorable man, okay? Clearly, right, Jacob was this righteous person. How come he's not doing what he should be doing as the righteous man, right? This seems to be why our sages were willing to have the Holy One say to Jacob, is this how you answer a woman's distraught? Right? There's a midrash that comes in who says that God calls Jacob to account for this. God sits down with him and says, hey, look it, your response here is not appropriate. You're not responding the way I want you to respond. You're not responding the correct way. This is not, I expect more from you in this instance, Jacob. I swear, God says, your sons will one day have to present themselves to her son, right? Right? Here's Jacob, who responds to Rachel in such a way as saying, this isn't my problem, this is your problem. I have this myriad of sons that he takes this great pride in, right? Jacob's puffed himself up at all these sons that Leah has provided him, and God's saying, just you watch, buddy. This woman is going to have a son, and all the other ones are going to bow down to them. Okay? Steve, what's your question?
Rachel was always Jacob's favorite. Why was he so harsh? In fact, when she ultimately does have children, they become his favorites.
Yeah. So we learn an awful lot, as I said at the outset, about the character of the three main protagonists in the story, right? We learn something about the nature of Jacob, we learn something about the nature of Rachel, and we learn something about the nature of Leah, okay? Leah begins the story, let me come back to that. Let me come back to that when we read a little further on, okay? Let's come back to that when we read a little bit further on. For the time being, just kind of hold it in your consciousness, okay? That this chapter here, in this chapter, we learn a lot about these three protagonists, okay? We discover something significant about their character as we carry through the story. So just hold on to that second. Just hold on to that thought for a minute or two, okay? So Nachmanides provides this midrashic interpretation for us, but then he goes on to give us just a straightforward. The straightforward sense is indeed that Rachel meant for Jacob to pray on her behalf and to get her children no matter what, right? Otherwise, she would kill herself with grief, okay? We're beginning to see something about the nature of Rachel. Rachel was the beautiful one, right? Rachel was the pretty one. When they were growing up together in Haran, she was the younger sister and she was the pretty one, okay? And Leah was the workhorse, okay? She's probably used to things going her way. She's used to having life kind of work out for her, okay? In fact, she's the working there, and she has this handsome guy that shows up, and he wants to marry her. He wants to marry her so much that he's willing to labor 7 years for the right to marry her. And then they get married, and she expects that everything's going to be rainbows and puppy dogs. And what does she find? It's not working out that way for her. It's not working out. And she's so grieved by it, right, that she's going to die, right? In some ways, look, it kind of echoes in some ways what Jonah says, right? Jonah is so wrought up over the fact that he's been sent on this mission by God, and the mission hasn't been come to pass. He's so wrought up, and God says, is it right to show angry? He says, I'm so angry, I want to die, right? She's so angry, she's so depressed by this that she's going to kill herself with grief. She spoke improperly, Nachmanides tells us, out of jealousy of her sister. She expected Jacob, out of his great love for her, which we know, to afflict himself, to don sackcloth and ashes, and to pray until she had children so she would not die of grief. Right? Essentially, what she said to Jacob was, look, you love me. I know you love me. You married me. You worked these 7 years to marry me. That's great. Do something about it. Right? Don't just sit there like a bump on a log. Don't just sit there and say, this isn't my problem, it's your problem. That's what he's saying there. He's saying, what do you mean? You want me to be like my father. You want me to be my grandfather. But let's remember, that was their problem, right? They didn't have children. I got kids. I got plenty of kids. Obviously, the problem's not with me, it's with you. And what Rachel's saying, that's not the response I need from you right now. I need you to get involved. I need you to do your part. I need you to intercede with, the one up there to try to help me out with this situation. Because if you don't, I'm gonna die. I'm not gonna be able to survive. If you love me, if you love me as you say you do, you got to help me and find some way to help me, however you possibly can. Right? We see this very different image of Rachel here. We see Rachel almost as like a pathetic character. I don't mean pathetic pejoratively. I mean, we have a lot of pathos. We feel bad for her, right? And we're meant to feel bad for her because, you know, she's this beautiful woman. She's always had wonderful things, and she marries this guy who's got this wonderful covenant, and it's supposed to be great. And yet the one thing she desperately wants more than anything else, to have children, has been denied to her. And any of you on the call who've ever, Steve, I see you in a second, any of you on the call who've ever experienced infertility, okay, or anyone in the call who's ever had a loved one or somebody in your family circle who's experienced infertility, you know what that pain feels like, right? And that's what she's saying. And more than anything, she needs to know that her husband's on her side with this. Okay, Steve.
Why couldn't she approach God herself? Where did this rule come from that only the men in the family could do that?
There's really not. And in fact, it's kind of the opposite. Okay. Because remember, last week we talked about Rebecca. Remember, Rebecca had twins in her womb. And what were the twins doing in her womb? Who remembers?
Fighting.
They were fighting. And what does Rebecca do? What does Rebecca do? Who remembers?
She cries to God.
That's exactly right. She goes to inquire of God, right? So it's not like the women in this family didn't know how to do that, right? It's not that the women in the family didn't have the capability of doing that, right? For some reason, Rachel can't bring herself to do that, or doesn't know to do that, or doesn't have the capacity to do that. We don't know why. We really don't. We really don't. Maybe it was a defect in her character, or maybe it's just the text didn't put it that way, and so we don't think about it. I mean, we can ask that question, and it's a fair question to ask. Why doesn't she get involved for her own sake? In fact, what the commentary says is that she does, but she does it very differently. Look at what Gersonides tells us, writing in the 14th century. She said, "Here is my maid Bill. Failing any advice from Jacob, what does Rachel do? She took her cue from what Sarah did. She said, fine, you don't want to help me. You don't want to get involved. Screw it. Let me figure it out. What did Sarah do? Sarah got a surrogate. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a surrogate. I'll bring her into the house myself if I have to." Right?
Did she not know that didn't work out too well in the long run?
Possibly. Maybe, I don't know. Listen, we can argue that point. We can absolutely argue that point. Right? Although the fact of the matter is, Jacob was not the same as Abraham, and that's a key piece of this. And I don't say that flippantly, and I don't say that just in regard. Flippant? Is flippant a word? Yeah. All right. Do you know what I mean? I'm not just being flip with this. Okay. Jacob is not Abraham, and it's important that he's not Abraham. Okay. Jacob is not Isaac, and it's important that he's not Isaac. As great as Abraham was, he had his limitations. As great as Isaac was, he had his limitations. Jacob doesn't have the same limitations, right? Abraham was very limited in his view of the covenant, and he thought, I got to give the covenant either to Esau I got to give the covenant either to Ishmael or to Isaac, and he had to pick. I give it to Isaac. Okay. Isaac was limited. He had the covenant. He could either give it to Esau or he could give it to Jacob. He had to pick. Okay. Jacob doesn't have that problem because Jacob can see it differently. He says, I have the covenant. I got 12 sons. Which am I going to give it to? I'm going to give it to all of them. Okay. Jacob is qualitatively different as Abraham. It's not to say that Abraham wasn't great, not to say Isaac wasn't great. Jacob was greater than Abraham and Isaac in a different way because he understood and saw the covenant in a way that the other two couldn't. Right. So, I don't think, we can argue that point, Steve. We can say, shouldn't Rachel have known better? Didn't Rachel know that it didn't work out for Abraham? Maybe she knew, but she said to herself, I don't have to worry because this husband of mine is different than his grandfather. right? And there's a comment a little bit later along from Nachmanides that sort of touches on that point that we'll see. Okay, everyone with me? Yeah. Thoughts, questions? You guys ready to move on? Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't remember everybody's names at this point. I'm working on it. Unmute yourself, my friend. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm Brad.
Brad, that's fine.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to put this without being offensive, but is it possible to look at this a little bit differently and say that Rachel is acting a bit like a drama queen, where with this "I'll kill myself with grief" line, because it doesn't work.
Right. Brad, you can't ask that question. Of course you can ask that question. That's a great question. That's a brilliant question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, she's maybe drama queen's not the right word, okay? But surely, yeah, she's playing the victim here. She absolutely is. Right? In the same way that Jonah was playing the victim in that story, okay? It's so terrible for me, I want to die, right? Okay, yeah. Listen, I here we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful because I certainly don't want to discount the experience that anybody who's ever had to deal with infertility has to deal with. It's very real. It's very painful. I don't mean to make light of it. Certainly not. Okay. But yeah, to some extent, she's playing the martyr here, right?
And apparently she doesn't know her husband very well because it doesn't work.
Well, it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work, okay, is because we're learning about these characters. And that's why I keep coming back to that same idea. We have this image of Rachel as Rachel, right? And now we're finding out
you're on mute. Not muted.
She might not be quite as angelic as we remember her to be. That she's got her character flaws, and they're coming out in this story. They're absolutely coming out in this story.
Excuse me, I have a question or statement.
Oh yeah, lay it on me.
Why is it seems it might be more offensive to men for a woman to say the most important thing in my life is my ability to have children, not you, my husband.
Listen, so here I want to be very careful with this. Look, we live in a very different kind of world in which our ancestors lived in. We live in a world where we think of ourselves and what we're able to do and what we have the right to do and how we have the right to look at ourselves and view ourselves is much more, we have a lot more options. I gave a sermon a week ago where I talked about the proliferation of terms that's used in the LGBTQ community. And that, when I was growing up, it was relatively simple. You were either gay or you were straight, you were a man or you were a woman. Nowadays, if you speak to any young people, if you have children or grandchildren or students, or if you speak to young people, they'll tell you there's dozens of different terms that they use now for how they view themselves, how they see their gender, how they view their sexuality. And it's all incredibly fluid. And to me, sometimes it seems like they're making it up as they go. And I think they absolutely are. I think what's happening is that nowadays, young people are discovering that we humans have this amazing ability of autonomy. We have this amazing ability to define ourselves however we see ourselves, right? We think we're born with these constraints, our gender or our sexuality. We were born with these constraints that are placed upon us that we can't escape from. I think what young people are trying to say is, nah, you can escape from anything. You can see yourself and define yourself however you want to be. Now, why is that important? For some women, being a mother to a child is at the core of their being. It's what they want to do more than anything else in the world. For other women, they don't necessarily have that same desire. They don't necessarily have that same drive. And just because they have it at one point in their life doesn't mean they won't have it at another, or because they have it at another point in their life doesn't mean they're going to have it at this point in their life, okay? And the same thing, I think, to a certain extent for men, right? There are some men I know, when I was growing up, I had friends, they couldn't wait to be fathers, okay? I had no idea what being a father was going to be like. Now that I am, I wouldn't want it any other way, but I had to sort of experience it before I really understood it. I think we have to be very, very, the reason I'm saying all this, I think we have to be very, very careful in viewing any of their motivation as being an absolute, right? I think we have to be very, very careful as viewing whatever Rachel's motivation was as being as absolute, or whatever Jacob's motivation was as an absolute, because I think it tends to take away from our understanding of what our own human natural drives are, and to realize that the other men on the call are not going to have the same drives that I am going to have just because we were biologically assigned male gender. And the same thing for women. I don't think we can assume every woman in our group this morning has the same drives necessarily just because they were assigned that biology of gender as female. So I think we can play with this. I think we can speculate on Rachel's motivation. I think we can say, well, yeah, she was really wrought up in this, and she was terribly emotional about it, and it had to be what it had to be for her. I think we can say that. I think we can also say she was maybe not being a drama queen. I know Marina made a comment. Oh no, I'm sorry. Steve made a comment. Rather than calling her drama queen, she's maybe less mature as Sarah. Okay, that's fine. That's another way of looking at it. We need to give her room for that interpretation, but we can't think that that's an absolute and speak that that had to be what it was, because I don't think it necessarily has to be, because I don't think it has to be for any human. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying? Let me see what Marina, Irene, Ramona, Sarah, Rebecca didn't have to share their husband. Okay, good. Yes, Marina, hold that thought. Absolutely. Yeah. We're gonna get there. All right. Let's look at verse 9. All right. Let's look at this section. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, right, she took her maid Silpah and gave her to Jacob as a concubine, right? And when Leah's maid Silpah bore Jacob a son, Leah said, what luck, right? She named him Gad, all right? And when Leah's maid Silpah bore Jacob a second son, she declared, what fortune. And she named him, women will deem me fortunate. She named him Asher, right? This word Asher here, which means happy, right? You got to be careful. There's an old phrase, Asher with an ayin doesn't lead to Asher with an aleph. Asher with an ayin means wealth, right? Wealth doesn't necessarily lead to happiness, right? So what ends up happening here is that Leah's not having any children, or she stopped conceiving, and she's looking around and she sees, well, look at this situation here. My sister gave her maid to Jacob and he slept with her and she had a couple of kids. And now she's got a couple of kids in her column, right? If we're tallying up the children here, she's got 2 up on me now. And she says, well, if she can do it, guess what? I can do it too, right? And this speaks a little bit to this nature of Leah that we're starting to see, right? Leah, listen, who remembers when we're first introduced to Leah, how is she described in Torah? How does Torah tell us Leah is? What phrase is used to describe her? You remember?
Weak
Leah
eyes.
has weak eyes.
Weak eyes. That's exactly right. Okay. We don't know exactly what that means. We can speculate on what that means, but she was, she was just kind of, she wasn't the great beauty, right? She wasn't the great beauty. Okay. Now we can imagine this role that Leah had growing up with this younger sister who was vavavu. Okay. Poor Leah, right? She is married off to this guy. I can imagine, right? One morning, Leah wakes up and her father comes in the room, says, guess what you're doing today? right? You're marrying this shmagegi here who thinks he's marrying your sister, okay? And what is Leah's response? Right? She doesn't have a choice. She doesn't have a choice. Now, here's the curious thing. Remember, we know for certain that Leah came from a place, Leah came from a culture where women had the choice of who they were going to marry. How do we know that? Cindy?
From Rebecca.
From Rebecca, from her aunt. That's exactly right. When Abraham's servant shows up to get a wife for Isaac, they say, well, we got to ask her if she wants to marry. So she comes from a place where women had a right to marry who they want. Okay, and presumably Rachel had the right to say, I want to marry Jacob, and Jacob said, I want to marry her. Okay, Leah never has that choice, and we know she never, because we're never told. The Torah never tells us. The Torah never tells us. So here's poor Leah, right, who's living her whole life in the shadow of her sister, and she wakes up one morning and says, you're marrying this shmagegi tonight, right? And what's the first thing that happens in the morning? The first thing that happens when Jacob rolls over and looks at Leah, what does he say? What does he do? He goes to Lavan and says, you screwed me, right? I was supposed to marry this one, and you married me to that one. Here's Leah, she's supposed to be a new bride. She's supposed to feel good about herself. And the first thing she hears is her husband now complaining that he's married to her, right? How's she supposed to feel? Okay. She sees her sister as the loved one. So what does she do? She says, what's most important to Jacob? What's most important to Jacob in all of this? What does he want more than anything else? He thinks it's love, but it's not love. What is it that Jacob wants more than anything else?
Sons.
A son.
Sex is good, right? But I don't mean, I'm not making a qualitative statement, okay? That's a good answer, yes. Not what I'm looking for. What does Jacob want? What?
A son.
A son. He wants kids. And Leah says to herself, you know what? Maybe I'm not the loved one, but I can give him something that my sister can't. And not only one, not only two, I can give him a whole mess of kids. And if she's going to play this game with her servant, guess what? I can play the exact same game. Right? We see in the story this development of the character of Leah. Leah comes through as a much stronger, more capable woman than we initially gave her credit for. Right? Look what she does. She takes this role and she steps into it. And this is, if you look, let's look at what Nachmanides says about this, because he touches on that very point. When Leah saw that she stopped bearing, okay? Now, initially, this is one of the reasons I like Nachmanides, because he starts out by saying, I don't know what the hell is going on here. I don't know what this story is all about, right? Or why Leah, who wasn't barren, by the way, would give her maid to Jacob to have children through her. This line is fabulous, all right? It is not normal for wives to get extra wives for their husbands, right? It's not normal for wives to want to get their husbands laid. It's just not. I mean, listen, no value statements. I know there's some couples out there that are into some weird stuff. God bless. It's up to you, whatever, okay? My experience for the most part has been that most wives are not looking to get their husbands laid, right? But this is what happens, okay? So there's got to be an explanation. There's got to be a reason. People don't normally behave like this, is what Nachmanides is saying. So there's got to be a reason. What could be the reason? We must admit that these women were prophets. They knew stuff that we didn't know. For instance, they knew that Jacob was intended to engender 12 tribes. They knew that was Jacob's destiny. Why? They were prophets. They were connected. They were plugged in. Leah then wanted the majority of them to come from her, or from her maid who was under her authority. That way her sister would not outproduce her. That is why Leah said, God has given me my reward for having given my son to my husband. This is in verse 18, right? Indeed, Nachmanides tells us, that's why Jacob went to her. For as the sages tell us, he also knew that he was to have 12 sons. He knew he was going to have 12 sons. Ultimately, Jacob didn't care where they came from, right? Again, learning things about these characters, learning things about their personalities, what was driving them and what was motivating them. The most important thing to Jacob was not who bore his children, but that somebody would bear his children. He wanted sons. Why? Perhaps since Abraham and Isaac did not have many sons, Jacob wanted many wives to make sure his offspring could take possession of the land. Jacob's goal, Jacob's ultimate goal was come back, right? Earlier in the Torah portion, the first thing, he has the dream at night. He sees the sulam, the ladder with the angels of God coming up and down on it. And God tells him, I'm giving you this land to you and your offspring as an ancestral holding. This will be your possession. Jacob says, my dad only had one son. He couldn't hold the land with one son. My father had only one son. He couldn't hold the land with only one son. I need to have more than one son. I got to have more than one wife. I got to make sure. God's telling me I'm going to have 12 sons. Fabulous. I don't care where I get them from, provided I get them, because that's the key. That's the key. Jacob wanted many wives to make sure his offspring could take possession of the land. Right? Because we're already told way back in Genesis 15 that they were returned from exile in the 4th generation. We got to get a move on here, folks. We got to get going here. Time's a ticking, right? Leah gave her maid to make sure he did not take an outsider as a wife. Abraham wanted more kids. He married a shiksa. He had 6 more kids with Keturah. Okay? We know, right? The whole reason why the whole reason why Abraham sends his servant to Haran to get a wife for Isaac is because he doesn't want to marry one of the local girls. Part of the reason why Jacob goes to Haran and his parents send him is because they don't want him to marry one of the local girls. They don't want him to marry out of their own line. Same thing here. That's the concern. They don't want Jacob to marry out of the line. He'll take sons wherever he can get them. They want to make sure they stay within the line of our people. Everyone see that? Everyone understand that?
But
Right, so when Marina, when you asked for that question, hang on just a second. When you asked that question, Sarah and Rebecca didn't have to share their husband with their sister. Right? They didn't want to have to share her. Right? But herein we find this motivation for Leah, who was stronger and more resilient, right, than we give her credit for. And we're going to see that in just a second. Somebody had their hand raised.
Yes.
Steve.
Yes.
Steve, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt with the headphones that's next to you on my screen, but
Kevin.
maybe not next to you in real life. Go ahead.
But weren't these maids outsiders? I mean, I realized once they came in, they became part of the community, but presumably if Jacob brought in an outsider, she would also.
Yes and no. Again, the story with Abraham and Hagar is very informative. It's very instructive, because everywhere that Hagar is mentioned, we're told what about Hagar?
She's an Egyptian.
That's it. Cindy's right. Everywhere Hagar is mentioned, we're told she's an Egyptian. Bilhah and Silpah are never presented to us as anything other than part of this group. Okay. Now you're right, Steve. When Jacob married somebody and brought her into the group, presumably they would become part of that group. You're absolutely right. I agree 100%. But there's something different about Hagar, and we know there's something different about Hagar because every time she's mentioned, her background, her ancestry is mentioned. Hagar never fit in with the group. It was always Hagar, the Egyptian. But it was never Bilhah and Silpah, the Assyrian or Edomite or wherever they were from. Okay, so you're right. You're absolutely right. Whoever he would have married would have been brought into the group. But there was something fundamentally different about Hagar than these two women, and that's the point that we come back to. All right, the gentleman with the headphones and the blue shirt. Tell me your name, my friend.
Yeah, hi. My name's Kevin Cohen.
Kevin, lay it on me, buddy.
Okay. So Rachel, she was a sheep herdress, I guess. That's what they called her. Does that mean that Laban had no sons? That the two girls were basically inheriting, the whole of Laban's wealth or whatever that is?
Okay. No, Laban does have sons, and we know that Laban has sons because later on, actually in this section, which we probably aren't going to reach because we're running out of time, but that's okay. You can do it on your own. We read this section of when Jacob starts to sort of split the flock, right? When he's ready to skip town. And Laban says to him, what shall your wages be? And he says, well, we'll do this thing with the speckled and streaked and spotted herds. And he begins to separate the herds. And there's those herds that he watches over, and then the herds that Laban's sons are watching over. So Laban has other children. He does. Rachel and Leah, however, play a significant role because they're the means whereby he's sort of tying himself to Jacob and his family, and to the covenant. We tend to forget nowadays, or at least most of us tend to forget nowadays, that marrying for love, okay, is a relatively new concept, right? For most of human history, you didn't marry somebody because you love them. Your families organized the marriage for you because the betrothal between you and somebody else was beneficial to your family. It linked you to a particular clan. It linked you to a particular group. It linked you to a somebody who was wealthy or powerful or of great significance or stature. Laban views his daughters, okay, as his means to make a connection with somebody who is powerful, okay? And we know that, and Laban knows that. Laban was many things, but he wasn't an idiot, okay? Later on in this same section, which again, we probably aren't going to get to, right? He's hesitant to let Jacob go. Why is he hesitant to let Jacob go? Because he knows he's been successful, right? He knows that he has flourished because Jacob is in his midst. He wants to cement these ties with Jacob because Jacob's bringing him power. Jacob's bringing him success. And the same reason that Pharaoh treasures Joseph and Potiphar before him treasures Joseph, because when Joseph is in their house, right, they're thriving, they're successful because God's with him. God's with Jacob. So as long as Jacob's with Laban, Laban's doing great. And it's not because God loves Laban, it's because God loves Jacob. Everything that Jacob touched, he's got Midas touch. Everything flourishes. Okay. So it's not so much that Laban is missing sons. It's that he's using his daughters as these pawns, right, to connect himself to a source of wealth and power to increase what he's got.
But is it normal for women to work and be sheep herdress?
Yeah, look, yes and no. Look, labor was divided up in a certain way. We know something about this family, right? We know that this was a hardy family, and we know it's a hardy family from the very beginning, the very first time they're introduced, right? Because when Isaac, when Abraham's servant Eliezer shows up at the well, right, and meets Rebecca, what is Rebecca doing, right? She's schlepping down a big pot, right? She's got a big amphora on her shoulder, and she's coming down to collect water to water the flocks, okay? So he identifies her and he sees her. Remember, what is Eliezer cooks up this test, right? He says, God, how am I going to know the right woman for my master's son? This is what I'm going to ask the women for some water. And the one that says, let me give you water and let me water your animals as well, I'm going to know that's the right one. Okay. He was looking for a certain skill set and a certain, let's say, personality or a set of values, right? He was looking for somebody that was a hard worker, but also somebody who understood the value of hospitality and looking out for a stranger. Why those things? Because Abraham and Isaac, by extension, they were shepherds. They were nomads. They wandered around. Isaac didn't need a wife that was some beauty model fashion plate that sat there, okay? He needed somebody who was a worker, but he also needed somebody who had the right personality, okay? So we know that this family, we know that Laban's family, this is who these people are, Okay, so Rachel's not only beautiful, okay, but she's a worker. She comes from a place where she's able to be a worker. So this isn't strange. This is untoward. This is who this family was. And the reason why it meshes so well with Abraham and his line is because that's who they needed. They needed these hardy people that were going to be able to tame the West, you know, to borrow a phrase from American history. States? All right. Let's take a look at this next section here, because now we're having mandrakes, and there's nothing I like better than a good mandrake. Okay, once at the time of the wheat harvest, Reuben came across some mandrakes out in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Rachel said, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Was it not enough for you to take my husband, that you would also take my son's mandrakes?" Look at Leah. Look at Leah. Leah is no longer just a doormat, right? Leah is no longer satisfied being just another one of Jacob's wives, okay? She is exerting herself, and she's saying, "I'm successful. I'm giving my husband what he wants, and you're not," right? He says, "Why? It wasn't enough for you to take away my husband." What does she mean? What does she mean that it was her husband? What is she trying to say? Right? Anybody know? By all rights, Jacob should have been her husband. Why should Jacob have been her husband? She was the oldest. Right? What is it that Lavan says? It's not our custom to marry off the younger daughter before the older daughter. By all rights, Leah's saying, he was my man, and you had to step in and foul it up. And now, not only are you going to step in and foul it up, but you're going to take away my son's mandrakes as well, like hell. Right? Again, character development. Right? We're seeing this behavior from Leah that's telling us something about this woman. She has grown into herself. She has grown into one of our matriarchs. Right? She's a leader of our people. She's tough. She's resilient. And she's not taking crap from anybody, even her own sister. Rachel replied, "Listen, I promise. He'll lie with you tonight in return for son of your man." Okay, fine. Look, I get it. Okay, and look, this is a different Rachel. This is a contrite Rachel. This is a Rachel who's not just lording herself over her sister because of her beauty or her significance or anything else. She's saying, "All right, we'll make a deal. We'll make a deal. All right, he'll lie with you tonight. Just give me some mandrakes." Fine. Jacob came home from the field in the evening. Leah went out to meet him and said, "You are to sleep with me tonight, for I've hired you with my son's mandrakes." There it is, right? Right? As clear as crystal. And he laid with her that night, and God heeded Leah, and she conceived and bore him a fifth son. God said, and she said, "God has given me my reward for having given my maid to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Okay, that's related to Sachar, reward. Okay. When Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son, Leah said, "God has given me a choice gift. This time my husband will exalt me. I've borne him a sixth son." So she named him Zebulon. And here's the word Zebulon, Zavalti here in the Hebrew. Sorry, Leah Zavati, right there. This is what we call, here it is. Hapax legomenon. It's a word that appears very infrequently or only once in all of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, and the derivation of it is somewhat confusing. If you look in the Plout, Plout has a footnote that says it may actually come from an Akkadian word. We don't know what it is. Born him sixth son named Zebulon, and last she bore him a daughter and named her Dinah. And we know Dinah, of course, because Dinah figures in significantly in the later story. Right? Let's talk about Nachmanides' last comment here, and then we'll call it quits for today. In Rashi's comment, now Rashi makes a comment, and he's trying to say, what is this plant that Reuben finds? Rashi says they're violets, or maybe they're jasmine. And Nachmanides comes and says Rashi's completely off the mark here. Not it. What the Arabs call jasmine has exactly the same name in Hebrew. Right? The word exists in Hebrew. As for violets, they're not in season at the time of the wheat harvest, so it couldn't have been violets, right? Suppose he just happened to encounter them. It's better to accept onkelos, that these are in fact mandrakes, as Rabbi Chaya bar Abba does in Genesis Rabbah. Okolos is a Aramaic translation of the Torah, and it not only is a translation, but it gives us some insights and commentary into understanding this text. Note, he says, the same word is used for this plant in Aramaic as in Arabic. Let's see what Ibn Azra had to comment there. And again, Nachmanides knows this, okay? Rashi lives in France. Rashi knows Old French. Rashi probably knew Latin. Nachmanides, North Africa, Spain, the Levant, he spoke Arabic, right? That was his language. So he knew Arabic. He said it's the same word in Hebrew and in English and in Aramaic. It says, not English, Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic. It does, they're mandrakes. As he notes, some think that they're helpful for conception. All right, the mandrake root resembles a human being. Okay, we're gonna find that in just a second. And in the old days, people would eat certain foods that resembled certain things to believe they had those properties. People once thought bananas were an aphrodisiac. Why? Because they're phallic shaped. Okay, we see that in a lot of things that are considered aphrodisiacs. Okay, Rachel only wanted them for her own pleasure and enjoyment. She finally conceived through prayer, not through medicine. Why is that line important? Why is that line important? Why is it important that she conceived not through medicine, but through prayer? Who's the hero in the story?
God.
Hero of the story is God. That's exactly right. Well, Reuben brought with the branches of the mandrake, and perhaps the fruit, which looks like an apple and has a pleasant smell. He did not bring the root, which is the part that resembles a human being, the part that people say is an aid for conception. If that's true at all, it was just a luck charm, nothing else. I, for one, have never seen this mentioned in the medical texts, right? So what Nachmanides is telling us, in all my studies as a physician, I've never ever seen where it says mandrakes are good for conception. Okay? Last little shtickle I want to give here is this comment of Bechor Shor, which is very interesting. Last she bore him a daughter named her Dinah. Since it does not say she conceived again, evidently Zebulon and Dinah were twins. There is a tradition that suggests for us that Zebulon and Dinah were twins because we're not told specifically that Rachel conceived again. All right. So listen, there's more that comes here. So finally, of course, Rachel conceives and bears Jacob, and then we have the business of the speckled and streaked animals that Jacob gets as his payment for all the labor that he's done. But we're running out of time here, so you can study all that on your own. So, dear friends, I thank you for this time that we've had together. As has been explained to me, the custom of the group, that at the end of our study together, we do the Kaddish and read the Kaddish list. So I'm going to go ahead and read the Kaddish list for this week. So we take time out of our worship today to remember our study today, to remember those from our community who are no more. We began, of course, by mentioning those who passed away during the past month. Miriam Betzalel, Rena Rosa Eliashar, Deborah Falcon, Ruth Friedman, Alan Gardner, Rana Goldstein, William Leisner, Mimi Lieber, Shirley Lindy, Nicole Nyman, Estera Pulvermacher, Helen Walder Rogaway, and Ronnie Vine. We also remember the yard sites of the following people whose anniversary of their death occurs at this season. Ted Armel, Jacob Begelman, Rose Bailey, Rebecca Baker, David Barkin, Goldie Benjamin, Randy Lynn Bennett, Isaac Bergman, Beverly Glazov Berman, Marwin Bernards, Samuel Gladys, Jean Brussel, Esther Caden, Francine Chernoff, David Cohen, Darrell Colford, and Cooper, Yerusha Rebecca Darvish, Abraham Diamond, Lillian Dishler, Ruben Dome, Jordan Michael Ehrlich, Edith Barron Fearman, Morton Fearman, Gary Finkel, Rachmiel Fogel, Joseph Foreman, Sima Frankel, Bertha Friedman, Joshua Gerson, Justin Gershuni, David Golden, Nathaniel Goldstein, Gene Gordon, Minnie Gordon, Charlie Grace, Betty Greenberg, J. Allen Hanover, Rose Harris, Janice Hatoff, Claire Altman Hein, Eric Hershowitz, Claire Jacobs, Iraj Kahanasa, David Kapoor, Najat Katan, Richard Kirshner, Eric Clapper, Morton Kleinberg, Robert Cohn, Haskell Kramer, Jane Litwin, Erna Lovis, Mort Lowy, Sion Mahani, Seymour Markowitz, Arlene Miller, Myron William Morris, Dorothy Osman, Shirley Pasternak, Rona Paymar, Samuel Pike, Isaac Pressman, Isadora Pugach, Tamara Rand, Jean Rappaport, Maury Redman, Meta Reese, Edward Maurice Regal, Ermo Riguero, Belle Rimmer, Rosangela Lucian Rinsky, Dora Levy Roddy, Edward Rudberg, Arnold Rosenzweig, Alan Rosen, Sarah Sager, Edith Schulhoff, Jenny Schwartz, Martin Schwartz, Dorothy Schwartz, Petroy, Linda Shear, Max Singer, Joseph Schlarver, William Sornoff, Paul Spindler, Louis Stark, Mayo Stark, Jack Stillerman, Lillian Tober, Ruth Warner, David Westheimer, and Jack Zitzman. Is there anybody else that's on the call today that would like to add a name to remember?
Mila Gadas, my grandmother.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, this week we also observed Veterans Day and also the anniversary of Kristallnacht. So it's fitting for us to pause for a moment to remember all of those who gave of themselves in defense of our nation and the martyrs of our people who died through the hatred of the Nazis. We join together, dear friends, in the words of Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish, which I will put up on the screen. And if it is your custom to do so, I invite you to please rise for Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah be'alma divra chirute v'amlich malchute b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael Bagala vizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shemei rabbah v'vorach leolam u'omei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach yitpa'ar yitramam v'yitnaseh. Yitadar yitaleh yitalal shemei d'kudusha barichu. Le'ela min kol birchata shigrata. Tushbachata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya, Chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom v'ramav, v'yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn, comfort all of those who are bereaved, as together we say, amen. Lastly, dear friends, just got a few announcements for you this morning. Congregant Gary Schiller will be leading a Shabbat meeting service on the Glazer campus, which you are welcome to attend. Proof of vaccination is required. Weekly at 6 p.m. No service the first Friday of the month. So if you want more information, there's weekly emails that come out from WBT, which contain the schedules for all the class offerings. We have something for everyone. Some upcoming online events. You hope you can daily emails, which give you information and links to the content that is being produced. Every week you can find Torah study on Fridays at noon, and of course, Chevra Torah on Saturdays at 9 a.m. For a complete calendar of upcoming events and links for viewing, feel free to visit wbtla.org/WBT@home, and there's more information available there. So dear friends, I thank you very much for this time that we have been able to study together. It was a great pleasure. I am hoping to be back out in California this summer, so maybe we'll have a chance to study together again during the summer. Lots of good things and blessings to you all. Please stay safe and have a great holiday season. Happy Thanksgiving and a wonderful light-filled Hanukkah and lots of jelly donuts and latke, depending on what your preference is. Okay, friends. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shalom.
Take care.
Shabbat
Thank you,
shalom.
Rabbi.
Be well.
Yeah, me too.
I fell asleep.